Chapter 2. Criticisms of the doctrine of non-resistance to evil by force on the part of believers and of unbelievers. The impression I gained of a desire to conceal, to hush up, what I had tried to express in my book led me to judge the book itself afresh. On its appearance, it had, as I had anticipated, been forbidden, and ought therefore by law to have been burnt. But at the same time it was discussed among officials, and circulated in a great number of manuscript and lithograph copies, and in translations printed abroad. And very quickly after the book, criticisms, both religious and secular in character, made their appearance, and these the government tolerated and even encouraged, so that the refutation of a book which no one was supposed to know anything about was even chosen as the subject for theological dissertations in the academies. The criticisms of my book, Russian and foreign alike, fall under two general divisions: the religious criticisms of men who regard themselves as believers, and secular criticisms, that is, those of freethinkers. I will begin with the first class. In my book, I made it an accusation against the teachers of the Church that their teaching is opposed to Christ's commands clearly and definitely expressed in the Sermon on the Mount, and opposed in especial to his command in regard to resistance to evil, and that in this way they deprive Christ's teaching of all value. The church authorities accept the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount on non-resistance to evil by force as divine revelation, and therefore one would have thought that if they felt called to write anything to write about my book at all, they would have found it inevitable before everything else to reply to the principal point of my charge against them, and to say plainly, do they or do they not admit the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount and the commandment of non-resistance to evil as binding on a Christian? And they were bound to answer this question not after the usual fashion, i.e., that although on the one side one cannot absolutely deny, yet on the other side one cannot fully assent, all the more seeing that, etc., etc. No, they should have answered the question as plainly as it was put in my book. Did Christ really demand from his disciples that they should carry out what he taught them in the Sermon on the Mount? And can a Christian then, or can he not, always remaining a Christian, go to law, or make any use of the law, or seek his own protection in the law? And can the Christian, or can he not, remaining a Christian, take part in the administration of government, using compulsion against his neighbors? And the most important question hanging over the heads of all of us in these days of universal military service: can the Christian, or can he not, remaining a Christian, against Christ's direct prohibition, promise obedience in future actions directly opposed to his teaching? And can he, by taking his share of service in the army, prepare himself to murder men and even actually murder them? These questions were put plainly and directly and seem to require a plain and direct answer. But in all the criticisms of my book, there was no such plain and direct answer. No, my book received precisely the same treatment as all the attacks upon the teachers of the Church for their defection from the law of Christ, of which history from the days of Constantine is full. A very great deal was said in connection with my book of my having incorrectly interpreted this and other passages of the Gospel, of my being in error in not recognizing the Trinity, the redemption, and the immortality of the soul. A very great deal was said, but not a word about the one thing for which every Christian is the most essential question in life: how to reconcile the duty of forgiveness, meekness, patience, and love for all, neighbors and enemies alike, which is so clearly expressed in the words of our teacher and in the heart of each of us. How to reconcile this duty with the obligation of using force in war upon men of our own or a foreign people. All that are worth calling answers to this question can be brought under the following 5 heads. I have tried to bring together, in this connection, all I could, not only from the criticisms of my book, but from what has been written in past times on this theme. The first and crudest form of reply consists in the bold assertion that the use of force is not opposed by the teaching of Christ, that it is permitted and even enjoined on the Christian by the Old and New Testaments. Assertions of this kind proceed for the most part from men who have attained the highest ranks in the governing or ecclesiastical hierarchy, and who are consequently perfectly assured that no one will dare to contradict their assertion, and that if anyone does contradict it, they will hear nothing of the contradiction. These men have, for the most part, through the intoxication of power, so lost the right idea of what Christianity is, in the name of which they hold their position, that what is Christian in Christianity presents itself to them as heresy, while everything in the Old and New Testaments which can be distorted into an anti-Christian and heathen meaning they regard as the foundation of Christianity. In support of their assertion that Christianity is not opposed to the use of force, these men usually, with the greatest audacity, bring together all the most obscure passages from the Old and New Testaments, interpreting them in the most unchristian way, the punishment of Ananias and Sapphira, of Simon the sorcerer, etc. They quote all those sayings of Christ which can possibly be interpreted as justification of cruelty. The expulsion from the temple, it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom than for this city, etc., etc. According to these people's notions, a Christian government is not in the least bound to be guided by the spirit of peace, forgiveness of injuries, and love for enemies. To refute such an assertion is useless, because the very people who make this assertion refute themselves, or rather renounce Christ, inventing a Christianity and a Christ of their own in the place of him in whose name the church itself exists, as well as their office in it. If all men were to learn that the church professes to believe in a Christ of punishment and warfare, not of forgiveness, no one would believe in the church, and it could not prove to anyone what it is trying to prove. The second, somewhat less gross form of argument consists in declaring that though Christ did indeed preach that we should turn the left cheek and give the cloak also, and this is the highest moral duty, yet that there are wicked men in the world, and if these wicked men were not restrained by force, the whole world and all good men would come to ruin through them. This argument I found for the first time in John Chrysostom, and show how he is mistaken in my book What I Believe. This argument is ill-grounded, because if we allow ourselves to regard any men as intrinsically wicked men, then in the first place we annul, and by doing so, the whole idea of Christian teaching, according to which we are all equals and brothers, and sons of one Father in heaven. Secondly, it is ill-founded, because even if to use force against wicked men had been permitted by God, since it is impossible to find a perfect and unfailing distinction by which one could positively know the wicked from the good, so it would come to all individual men and societies of men mutually regarding each other as wicked men, as is the case now. Thirdly, even if it were possible to distinguish the wicked from the good unfailingly, even then it would be impossible to kill or injure or shut up in prison these wicked men, because there would be no one in a Christian society to carry out such punishment, since every Christian, as a Christian, has been commanded to use no force against the wicked. The third kind of answer, still more subtle than the preceding, consists in asserting that though the command of non-resistance to evil by force is binding on the Christian when the evil is directed against himself personally, it ceases to be binding when the evil is directed against his neighbors, and that then the Christian is not only not bound to fulfill the commandment, but is even bound to act in opposition to it in defense of his neighbors, and to use force against transgressors by force. This assertion is an absolute assumption, and one cannot find in all Christ's teaching any confirmation of such an argument. Such an argument is not only a limitation, but a direct contradiction and negation of the commandment. If every man has the right to have recourse to force in face of a danger threatening another, the question of the use of force is reduced to a question of the definition of danger for another. If my private judgment is to decide the question of what is danger for another, there is no occasion for the use of force which could not be justified on the ground of danger threatening some other man. They killed and burnt witches, they killed aristocrats and Girondists, they killed their enemies because those who were in authority regarded them as dangerous for the people. If this important limitation, which fundamentally undermines the whole value of the commandment, had entered into Christ's meaning, there must have been mention of it somewhere. This restriction is made nowhere in our Savior's life or preaching. On the contrary, warning is given precisely against this treacherous and scandalous restriction, which nullifies the commandment. The error and impossibility of such a limitation is shown in the Gospel with special clearness in the account of the judgment of Caiaphas, who makes precisely this distinction. He acknowledged that it was wrong to punish the innocent Jesus, but he saw in him a source of danger not for himself, but for the whole people, and therefore he said, "It is better for one man to die, that the whole people perish not." And the erroneousness of such a limitation is still more clearly expressed in the words spoken to Peter, when he tried to resist by force evil directed against Jesus. Matthew 26:52. Peter was not defending himself, but his beloved and heavenly Master, and Christ at once reproved him for this, saying that he who takes up the sword shall perish by the sword. Besides, apologies for violence used against one's neighbor in defense of another neighbor from greater violence are always untrustworthy, because when force is used against one who has not yet carried out his evil intent, I can never know which would be greater, the evil of my act of violence or of the act I want to prevent. We kill the criminal that society may be rid of him, and we never know whether the criminal of today would not have been a changed man tomorrow, and whether our punishment of him is not useless cruelty. We shut up the dangerous as we think member of our society, but the next day this man might cease to be dangerous, and his imprisonment might be for nothing. I see that a man I know to be a ruffian is pursuing a young girl. I have a gun in my hand, I kill the ruffian and save the girl. But the death or the wounding of the ruffian has positively taken place, while what would have happened if this had not been, I cannot know. And what an immense mass of evil must result, and indeed does result, from allowing men to assume the right of anticipating what may happen. 99% of the evil in this world is founded on this reasoning, from the Inquisition to dynamite bombs and the executions or punishments of tens of thousands of political criminals. A fourth, still more refined reply to the question, what ought to be the Christian's attitude to Christ's command of non-resistance to evil by force, consists in declaring that they do not deny the command of non-resisting evil, but recognize it, but that they do not ascribe to this command the special exclusive value attached to it by sectarians. To regard this command as the indispensable condition of Christian life, as Garrison, Ballou, Diamond, the Quakers, the Mennonites, and the Shakers do now, and as the Moravian Brothers, the Waldenses, the Albigenses, the Bogolomites, and the Paulicians did in the past, is a one-sided heresy. This command has neither more nor less value than all the other commands, and the man who through weakness transgresses any command whatever, the command of non-resistance included, does not cease to be a Christian if he hold the true faith. This is a very skillful device, and many people who wish to be deceived are easily deceived by it. The device consists in reducing a direct conscious denial of a command to a casual breach of it. But one need only compare the attitude of the teachers of the Church to this and to other commands which they really do recognize, to be convinced that their attitude to this is completely different from their attitude to other duties. The command against fornication they do really recognize, and consequently they do not admit that in any case fornication can cease to be wrong. The church preachers never point out cases in which in which the command against fornication can be broken, and always teach that we must avoid seductions which lead to temptation to fornication. But not so with the command of non-resistance. All church preachers recognize cases in which that command can be broken, and teach the people accordingly. And they not only do not teach that we should avoid temptations to break it, chief of which is the military oath, but they themselves administer it. The preachers of the church never in any other case advocate the breaking of any other commandment. But in connection with the commandment of non-resistance, they openly teach that we must not understand it too literally, but that there are conditions and circumstances in which we must do the direct opposite, that is, go to law, fight, punish, so that occasions for fulfilling the commandment of non-resistance to evil by force are taught, for the most part, as occasions for not fulfilling it. The fulfillment of this commandment, they say, is very difficult and pertains only to perfection. And how can it not be difficult when the breach of it is not only not forbidden, but law courts, prisons, cannons, guns, armies, and wars are under the immediate sanction of the Church? It cannot be true, then, that this command is recognized by the preachers of the Church as on a level with other commands. The preachers of the Church clearly do not recognize it. Not only not daring to acknowledge this, they try to conceal their not recognizing it. So much for the fourth reply. The fifth kind of answer, which is the subtlest, the most often used, and the most effective, consists in avoiding answering, in making believe that this question is one which has long ago been decided perfectly clearly and satisfactorily, and that it is not worthwhile to talk about it. This method of reply is employed by all the more or less cultivated religious writers, that is to say, those who feel the laws of Christ binding for themselves. Knowing that the contradiction existing between the teaching of Christ which we profess with our lips and the whole order of our lives cannot be removed by words, and that touching upon it can only make it more obvious, they, with more or less ingenuity, evade it, pretending that the question of reconciling Christianity with the use of force has been decided already, or does not exist at all. I only know of one work which differs somewhat from this general definition, and that is not a criticism in the precise meaning of the word, but an article treating of the same subject, and having my book in view. I mean the pamphlet of Mr. Troitsky, published at Kazan, A Sermon for the People. The author obviously accepts Christ's teaching in its true meaning. He says that the prohibition of resistance to evil by force means exactly what it does mean, and the same with the prohibition of swearing. He does not, as others do, deny the meaning of Christ's teaching, but unfortunately he does not draw from this admission the inevitable deductions which present themselves spontaneously in our life, when we understand Christ's teaching in that way. If we must not oppose evil by force, nor swear, everyone naturally asks, how then about military service, and the oath of obedience? To this question the author gives no reply, but it must be answered. And if he cannot answer, then he would do better not to speak on the subject at all, as such silence leads to error. The majority of religious critics of my book use this fifth method of replying to it. I could quote dozens of such critics, in all of whom, without exception, we find the same thing repeated. Everything is discussed except what constitutes the principal subject of the book. As a characteristic example of such criticisms, I will quote the article of a well-known and ingenious English writer and preacher, Farrer, who, like many learned theologians, is a great master of the art of circuitously evading a question. The article was published in an American journal, The Forum, in October 1888. After conscientiously explaining in brief the contents of my book, Farrer says, quote, Tolstoy came to the conclusion that a coarse deceit had been palmed upon the world when these words, resist not evil, were held by civil society to be compatible with war, courts of justice, capital punishment, divorce, oaths, national prejudice, and indeed with most of the institutions of civil and social life. He now believes that the kingdom of God would come if all men kept these 5 commandments of Christ, viz., 1. Live in peace with all men. 2. Be pure. 3. Take no oaths. 4. Resist not evil. 5. Renounce national distinctions. Tolstoy, he says, rejects the inspiration of the Old Testament, hence he rejects the chief doctrines of the Church, that of the atonement by blood, the Trinity, the descent of the Holy Ghost on the apostles, and his transmission through the priesthood. And he recognizes only the words and commands of Christ. But is this interpretation of Christ a true one, he says? Are all men bound to act as Tolstoy teaches, i.e. to carry out these 5 commandments of Christ? Unquote. You expect, then, that in answer to this essential question, which is the only one that could induce a man to write an article about the book, he will say either that this interpretation of Christ's teaching is true, and we ought to follow it, or he will say that such an interpretation is untrue, will show why, and will give some other correct interpretation of those words which I interpret incorrectly. But nothing of this kind is done. Farrer only expresses his belief that, quote, Although actuated by the noblest sincerity, Count Tolstoy has been misled by partial and one-sided interpretations of the meaning of the gospel and the mind and will of Christ." Unquote. What this error consists in is not made clear. It is only said, quote, "To enter into the proof of this is impossible in this article, for I have already exceeded the space at my command." Unquote. And he concludes in a tranquil spirit, quote, "Meanwhile, the reader who feels troubled lest it should be his duty also to forsake all the conditions of his life and to take up the position and work of a common laborer, may rest for the present on the principle securus judicat orbis terrarum, with few and rare exceptions." Unquote. He continues, quote, "The whole of Christendom, from the days of the apostles down to our own, has come to the firm conclusion that it was the object of Christ to lay down great eternal principles, not to disturb the bases and revolutionize the institutions of all human society, which themselves rest on divine sanctions as well as on inevitable conditions. Were it my object to prove how untenable is the doctrine of communism, based by Count Tolstoy upon the divine paradoxes, which can be interpreted only on historical principles, in accordance with the whole method of the teaching of Jesus, it would require an ampler canvas than I have here at my disposal." Unquote. What a pity he has not an ampler canvas at his disposal, and what a strange thing it is that for all these last 15 centuries no one has had a canvas ample enough to prove that Christ, whom we profess to believe in, says something utterly unlike what he does say. Still, they could prove it if they wanted to, but it is not worthwhile to prove what everyone knows. It is enough to say securus judicat orbis terrarum. And of this kind, without exception, are all the criticisms of educated believers, who must as such understand the danger of their position. The sole escape from it for them lies in their hope that they may be able, by using the authority of the Church, of antiquity, and of their sacred office, to overawe the reader and draw him away from the idea of reading the gospel for himself and thinking out the question in his own mind for himself. And in this they are successful. For indeed, how could the notion occur to anyone that all that has been repeated from century to century with such earnestness and solemnity by all those archdeacons, bishops, archbishops, holy synods, and popes, is all of it a base lie and a calumny foisted upon Christ by them for the sake of keeping safe the money they must have to live luxuriously on the necks of other men? And it is a lie and a calumny so transparent that the only way of keeping it up consists in overawing people by their earnestness, their conscientiousness. It is just what has taken place of late years at recruiting sessions, at a table before the Zertzal, the symbol of the Tsar's authority. In the seat of honor, under the life-size portrait of the Tsar, sit dignified old officials, wearing decorations, conversing freely and easily, writing notes, summoning men before them, and giving orders. Here, wearing a cross on his breast, near them, is prosperous-looking old priest in a silken cassock, with a long gray hair flowing onto his cope, before a lectern who wears the golden cross and has a gospel bound in gold. They summon Ivan Petrov. A young man comes in, wretchedly, shabbily dressed, and in terror, the muscles of his face working, his eyes bright and restless, and in a broken voice hardly above a whisper, he says, "I, by Christ's law, as a Christian, I cannot." "What is he muttering?" asked the president, frowning impatiently and raising his eyes from his book to listen. "Speak louder," the colonel, with shining epaulets, shouts to him. I as a Christian," and at last it appears that the young man refuses to serve in the army because he is a Christian. "Don't talk nonsense. Stand to be measured. Doctor, may I trouble you to measure him? He is all right?" "Yes." Reverend Father, administer the oath to him. No one is the least disturbed by what the poor, scared young man is muttering. They do not even pay attention to it. They all mutter something, but we've no time to listen to it. We have to enroll so many. The recruit tries to say something still. It's opposed to the law of Christ. Go along, we know without your help what is opposed to the law and what's not. And you soothe his mind, Reverend Father, soothe him. Next, Vasily Nikitin. And they lead the trembling youth away. And it does not strike anyone, the guards or Vasily Nikitin, whom they are bringing in, or any of the spectators of this scene, that these inarticulate words of the young man, at once suppressed by the authorities, contain the truth, and that the loud, solemnly uttered sentences of the calm, self-confident official and the priest are a lie and a deception. Such is the impression, not only by Farrar's article, but by all those solemn sermons, articles, and books which make their appearance from all sides directly, there is anywhere a glimpse of truth exposing a predominant falsehood. At once begins the series of long, clever, ingenious, and solemn speeches and writings which deal with questions nearly related to the subject, but skillfully avoid touching the subject itself. That is the essence of the fifth and most effective means of getting out of the contradictions in which church Christianity has placed itself, by professing its faith in Christ's teaching in words while it denies it in its life, and teaches people to do the same. Those who justify themselves by the first method directly, crudely asserting that Christ sanctioned violence, wars, and murder, repudiate Christ's doctrine directly. Those who find their defense in the second, the third, or the fourth method are confused and can easily be convicted of error. But this last class, who do not argue, who do not condescend to argue about it, but take shelter behind their own grandeur, and make a show of all this having been decided by them, or at least by someone long ago, and no longer offering a possibility of doubt to anyone, they seem safe from attack, and will be beyond attack till men come to realize that they are under the narcotic influence exerted on them by governments and churches, and are no longer affected by it. Such was the attitude of spiritual critics, i.e. those professing faith in Christ, to my book, and their attitude could not have been different. They are bound to take up this attitude by the contradictory position in which they find themselves between belief in the divinity of their master and disbelief in his clearest utterances, and they want to escape from this contradiction, so that one cannot expect from them free discussion of the very essence of the question, that is, of the change in men's life which must result from applying Christ's teaching to the existing order of the world. Such free discussion I only expected from worldly, free-thinking critics who are not bound to Christ's teaching in any way, and can therefore take an independent view of it, as the founder of a religion of personal salvation, but to express it in their language, as a reformer who laid down new principles of life and destroy the old, and whose reforms are not yet complete but are still in progress even now. Such a view of Christ and his teaching follows from my book, but to my astonishment, out of the great number of critics of my book, there was not one, either Russian or foreign, who treated the subject from the side from which it was approached in the book. That is, who criticized Christ's doctrines as philosophical, moral, social principles, to use their scientific expressions. This was not done in a single criticism, the free-thinking Russian critics taking my book as though its whole contents could be reduced to non-resistance to evil, and understanding the doctrine of non-resistance to evil itself, no doubt for greater convenience in refuting it, as though it would prohibit every kind of conflict with evil, fell vehemently upon this doctrine, and for some years past have been very successfully proving that Christ's teaching is mistaken insofar as it forbids resistance to evil. The refutations of this hypothetical doctrine of Christ were all the more successful since they knew beforehand that their arguments could not be contested or corrected, for the censorship, not having passed the book, did not pass articles in its defense. It is a remarkable thing that among us, where one cannot say a word about the Holy Scriptures without the prohibition of the censorship, for some years past, there have been in all the journals constant attacks and criticisms on the command of Christ simply and directly stated in Matthew 5:39. The Russian advanced critics, obviously unaware of all that has been done to elucidate the question of non-resistance, and sometimes even imagining, apparently, that the rule of non-resistance to evil has been invented by me personally, fell foul of the very idea of it. They opposed it and attacked it, and advancing with great heat arguments which had long ago been analyzed and refuted from every point of view, they demonstrated that a man ought invariably to defend with violence all the injured and oppressed, and that thus the doctrine of non-resistance to evil is an immoral doctrine. To all Russian critics, the whole import of Christ's command seemed reducible to the fact that it would hinder them from the active opposition to evil to which they are accustomed, so that the principle of non-resistance to evil by force has been attacked by two opposing camps. The conservatives, because this principle would hinder their activity and resistance to evil as applied to the revolutionists, in persecution and punishment of them. The revolutionists, too, because this principle would hinder their resistance to evil as applied to the conservatives in the overthrowing of them. The conservatives were indignant at the doctrine of non-resistance to evil by force hindering the energetic destruction of the revolutionary elements, which may ruin the national prosperity. The revolutionists were indignant at the doctrine of non-resistance to evil by force hindering the overthrow of the conservatives who are ruining the national prosperity. It is worthy of remark in this connection that the revolutionists have attacked the principle of non-resistance to evil by force in spite of the fact that it is the greatest terror and danger for every despotism. For ever since the beginning of the world, the use of violence of every kind, from the Inquisition to the Schlüsselburg fortress, has rested and still rests on the opposite principle of the necessity of resisting evil by force. Besides this, the Russian critics have pointed out the fact that the application of the command of non-resistance to practical life would turn mankind aside out of the path of civilization along which it is moving. The path of civilization on which mankind in Europe is moving is, in their opinion, the one along which all mankind ought always to move. So much for the general character of Russian critics. Foreign critics started from the same premises, but their discussions of my book were somewhat different from those of Russian critics, not only in being less bitter and in showing more culture, but even in the subject matter. In discussing my book and the gospel teaching generally, as it is expressed in the Sermon on the Mount, the foreign critics maintain that such doctrine is not peculiarly Christian. Christian doctrine is either Catholicism or Protestantism according to their views. The teaching of the Sermon on the Mount is only a string of very pretty, impracticable dreams du charmant docteur, as Rerin says, fit for the simple and half-savage inhabitants of Galilee who lived 1800 years ago, and for the half-savage Russian peasants, Sutayev and Bondarev, and the Russian mystic Tolstoy, but not at all consistent with a high degree of European culture. The foreign free-thinking critics have tried in a delicate manner, without being offensive to me, to give the impression that my conviction that mankind could be guided by such a naive doctrine as that of the Sermon on the Mount proceeds from two causes: that such a conviction is partly due to my want of knowledge, my ignorance of history, my ignorance of all the vain attempts to apply the principles of the Sermon on the Mount to life, which have been made in history and have led to nothing, and partly it is due to my failing to appreciate the full value of the lofty civilization to which mankind has attained at present, with its Krupp cannons, smokeless powder, colonization of Africa, Irish coercion bill, parliamentary government, journalism, strikes, and the Eiffel Tower. So wrote de Vogüé and Leroy Beaulieu and Matthew Arnold. And so wrote the American author Savage and Ingersoll, the popular free-thinking American preacher, and many others. Christ's teaching is no use because it is inconsistent with our industrial age, says Ingersoll naively, expressing in this utterance with perfect directness and simplicity the exact notion of Christ's teaching held by persons of refinement and culture of our times. The teaching is no use for our industrial age, precisely as though the existence of the industrial age were a sacred fact which ought not to and could not be changed. It is just as though drunkards, when advised how they could be brought to habits of sobriety, should answer that the advice is incompatible with their habit of taking alcohol. The arguments of all the free-thinking critics, Russian and foreign alike, different as they may be in tone and manner of presentation, all amount essentially to the same strange misapprehension. Namely, that Christ's teaching, one of the consequences of which is non-resistance to evil, is of no use to us because it requires a change of our life. Christ's teaching is useless because, if it were carried into practice, life could not go on as at present, we must add, if we have begun by living sinfully, as we do live and are accustomed to live. Not only is the question of non-resistance to evil not discussed, the very mention of the fact that the duty of non-resistance enters into Christ's teaching is regarded as satisfactory proof of the impracticability of the whole teaching. Meanwhile, one would have thought it was necessary to point out at least some kind of solution to the following question, since it is at the root of almost everything that interests us. The question amounts to this: in what way are we to decide men's disputes when some men consider evil what others consider good and vice versa? And to reply that it is evil that is evil which I think evil, in spite of the fact that my opponent thinks it good, is not a solution of the difficulty. There can be only two solutions, either to find a real, unquestionable criterion of what is evil, or not to resist evil by force. The first course has been tried, ever since the beginning of historical times, and as we all know, it has not hitherto led to any successful results. The second solution, not forcibly to resist what we consider evil until we have found a universal criterion, that is the solution given by Christ. We may consider the answer given by Christ unsatisfactory. We may replace it by another, and better, by finding a criterion by which evil could be defined for all men unanimously and simultaneously. We may simply, like savage nations, not recognize the existence of the question. But we cannot treat the question as the learned critics of Christianity do. They pretend either that no such question exists at all, or that the question is solved by granting to certain persons or assemblies of persons the right to define evil and to resist it by force. But we know all the while that granting such a right to certain persons does not decide the question. Still less so when we are ourselves the certain persons, since there are always people who do not recognize this right in the authorized persons or assemblies. But this assumption, that what seems evil to us is really evil, shows a complete misunderstanding of the question, and lies at the root of the argument of free-thinking critics about the Christian religion. In this way, then, the discussions of my book on the part of churchmen and free-thinking critics alike showed me that the majority of men simply do not understand either Christ's teaching or the questions which Christ's teaching solves.